So I will introduce our first speaker, Brian Sullivan. He's a wetland coordinator for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And he's going to give us an introduction to the populations of waterfowl along the South Platte. Brian, you can forward.
Want a space bar?
Or the space bar.
Okay, thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Colin, for pulling us all together. I'm really looking forward to the workshop today. This will be great, wonderful opportunity for information transfer. Really a lot of great wetland management expertise in this room, so should be good. I'd like to first acknowledge my co-contributors today for the short presentation on waterfowl and their habitats in northeastern Colorado. Colin mentioned that Jim Gamley could not be here today. That's unfortunate. A lot of the material in this slideshow is from Jim. He's really in his element at a meeting like this. He's got a real strong background in wetland ecology and management, as I think a lot of you know, and he sends his regrets for not being here. But he's a major contributor, along with Mindy Rice from his staff, who's done some spatial modeling for us that I'll talk about briefly. And then Joanna Lemley and her staff at CNHP are leading a study right now in this river basin of wetland mapping and assessment, and I'm only going to talk about that briefly because the results of that work is going to be worthy, I think, of a whole other workshop or a meeting someday not too far down the road. What I'd like to do in my brief time this morning is to talk about the common waterfowl species, especially emphasizing ducks in this watershed, their seasonal abundance, their current population status, and how that compares to population goals that have been established for these birds. And then finally and importantly, briefly talk about the habitat types, their availability on the landscape, their use and by these birds, and what we perceive as the values of the different wetland types for these birds. If I do my job, I'll be setting the stage for the next presentations on waterfowl biology, nutritional requirements, and then wetland habitat management. I guess another title for the presentation could be, well, why are we doing this? Why is there 50 or 60 people here? Why do we spend all this time, energy, and money managing wetlands in this landscape? Well, they're an important resource for wildlife, and that's why most of us are here. And there's continental management plans and conservation plans established for migratory bird populations. We'll be talking about waterfowl today. So we have the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and other birds like shorebirds benefit from our wetland management activities too. There's basically a hemispheric shorebird conservation plan. And so in order to make the continental and international plans work, we have to take care of the habitat in our backyard. So everything we do on the landscape here in northeast Colorado feeds up and helps sustain populations at much bigger scales than right here. We're addressing directly the plans, broader scale plans with our work. And by the way, we've lost about 50% of the wetlands in Colorado, and I'll talk briefly about some of the habitat changes in this river basin. Wetlands are so important that there's a number of grassroots groups operating in Colorado. We call them wetland focus area committees, and a number of you in the room are involved with the one in the South Platte area. And I just mention this because, as I understand, this workshop was first discussed just back in June at a meeting in the South Platte Wetlands Focus Area Committee. So thanks for those of you that participate in that group, and if some of you have never participated, I'd encourage you to try to get involved. Thanks to Noe for her leadership as the current chair of that group, and again to Colin for pulling this together. So here's the cast of characters that we're primarily going to be talking about today. These are just 5 species of dabbling ducks. I'm not going to spend any time talking about geese today in this presentation, because they're a lot less wetland dependent than ducks are. We have 5 species of dabbling ducks are the most common in this area. 2 species of teal, blue-wing and green-wing, mallard, which is the dominant and most common duck, and then the gadwall and the widgeon. Again, they're all dabbling ducks. They don't dive for their food. They feed in shallow water by dabbling on the surface or tipping up and feeding in a few inches of water, generally less than a foot deep. The mallard is a bird, it's a generalist, and they will feed in agricultural fields, as you know, like on waste corn. But some of these other species don't do that as much, especially like the blue-winged teal and the gadwall. They get almost all of their food resources from wetlands, so wetland management is especially important for them. We can look at the species composition of the duck harvest in northeast Colorado, and again, it's these 5 species that are dominant in the harvest, about 90% total, with the majority of that being mallards. And so this is just harvest data from northeast Colorado. You can see that annually we're harvesting tens of thousands of ducks just in this lower South Platte Basin. So it's a very important area for waterfowl hunting and harvest in Colorado. In fact, it's the most important area in the entire state. Here's some county-by-county harvest statistics for the Central Flyway. So there's no shading in western Colorado, which is in the Pacific Flyway. But look at the counties here in northeast Colorado. Weld, Logan, and Morgan counties are in that dark purple color. High harvest counties within the whole flyway, much less Colorado, rivaling some of the counties up in some of the more famous waterfowl hunting areas like up in the Dakotas. And so again, the harvest statistics show the importance of this area, and also you can see some of the other colors, counties colored in, like along the Arkansas Valley, San Luis Valley, and then even North Park. I think you know that these birds are mostly migratory, and most of them are passing through Colorado. We look at banding data to see when a banded bird is shot, where was it banded? And so you can see the numbers in those boxes. The 82 number, that box includes Colorado. A lot of local birds in Colorado are harvested here. Birds that are nesting, for example, up in North Park will move down east into the river valley here. Band returns show that. But we get a lot of birds from our north, both Wyoming and Montana, then especially up in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Strong nesting component up there that migrates through. And many of these birds just pass through eastern Colorado and spend the winter further south, Texas, New Mexico, and even into Old Mexico. So that was banding data. There's also information available from satellite telemetry studies. And Colin here was actually involved in a study back from USGS in the early 2000s. I believe these birds, Colin, were marked on the wintering areas, right? New Mexico and Old Mexico.
Right.
And then we're able to follow their migration. So this was a pintail study. And at least a couple of those birds, as you can see from the maps here, did stop in the lower South Platte Basin on their migration. So here's some data on the fall and winter abundance of birds in the South Platte Basin, based on some periodic surveys over the past few years. Again, we're primarily a migration area. The populations tend to build slowly in the early part of the fall, numbers increasing from September with the teal migration starting into October. November, December, and January are peak months. From year to year, it's kind of different. You know, one year is different to the next in terms of which months the birds are going to be most abundant. But they're here during the fall and the winter primarily. Populations are tailing off in the late winter period usually. We don't have good survey data in the spring, but there's been some short-term studies. RMBO did one in 2006. They just looked at 11 managed wetlands out in this basin. 16 wetlands. But they estimated a bunch of birds and 75,000 ewes stays just on those wetlands. They extrapolated that to over 400,000 ewes stays on similar type of projects that they didn't look at within the basin. And again, this is just a small number of managed wetlands. They're hosting hundreds of thousands of duck ewes stays in one spring migration season. If you look at all the other wetlands in the basin, spring migration is a very significant period. Again, we don't have good numbers, but if you're out on this landscape in the month of March, there's a lot of waterfowl and a lot of ducks moving through this area in the spring. The timing of the harvest, based on the harvest information, also gives us an indication of when these birds are here. I mentioned earlier that the teal tend to migrate early, so if you look at the blue component of these pie charts, that's the birds that are harvested early in the fall, September and October. You'll see for blue and teal, they're almost exclusively harvested early. And if you look at mallards and the purple color, which is harvested late in the season, January is near the end of the duck hunting season, mallards more than any duck are harvested late. They're bigger, they tolerate the cold weather more, they can roost in warm water sloughs and feed in cornfields, for example. And then the other species like gadwall and widgeon are sort of more intermediate season migrants, with a few staying late, a few coming early, and a lot of them here in sort of November, mid-season time frame. And here we're showing the midwinter counts for ducks in the South Platte Basin. There's a coordinated survey for all the states in the flyway, usually the first week in January every year. And you'll see a dramatic drop-off in this area in the 1980s. Really dramatic, and there's a number of possible explanations for this. There was a whole blue ribbon panel of experts a few years ago that was appointed to sort of look into this issue. And habitat changes is a very important potential cause for the decline here. And that's what I'll be emphasizing today, but there are other issues that were discussed too, such as the amount of hunting pressure in the area, the changes in production from the breeding grounds and so forth. There's probably not one single cause to explain this, but this trend has been very much a cause for concern. You see it stabilized now, but at a level that's maybe half of what it used to be, at least for the middle of the winter period. So we're talking 50,000 ducks in a good year now, 100,000 ducks in this corridor during this survey. So how does that compare to the population goals that have been established? Well, the Platte Lakes Joint Venture, one of their tasks is to establish population objectives for different bird species, including waterfowl. And so they're not just looking at this basin, but they look at all of eastern Colorado, and the objective that they established, which has been stepped down from the Continental Plan. So if everybody does their part, we should sustain populations at the level desired for the whole continent. And what that analysis determined was that we need to be hosting over 300,000 ducks in the winter in eastern Colorado. We're far from that right now. We have to remember that we do include the Republican and the Arkansas Basin too in these numbers, but we're far short of that right now. And I think a few decades ago we were probably right in that ballpark, but we're far from that now. So that's an important point to keep in mind. We don't really have the birds that we'd like to have to do our share for the continental population right now. And the Platte Lakes Joint Venture also estimated the number of use days, and I believe that this topic will get more discussion by some future speakers this morning. But the PLJV estimated that in order to achieve the continental goals in eastern Colorado, we should be supporting, for example, 11 million use days for waterfowl in the fall and 37 million in the spring. So that's very sizable numbers of use days, and we'll talk about that later in the context of feeding birds from our wetland resources. So we have the river corridor, but the birds are mobile and they'll use a bunch of different habitat types in the basin. We've got the river itself and some adjacent habitats like the sloughs and moist soil units, augmentation ponds, the ditch system for our irrigation system, playas further out in the uplands. So all these habitats are potentially available for birds, and the large reservoirs, as you know, are used a lot for roosting. The birds distribute themselves on these habitats differently depending on what time of year we're talking about. For example, in the river floodplain, we see increasing use throughout the season and use peaking during the coldest part of the year during the winter. And that makes sense because some of these other habitats, like the shallow water wetlands and even the reservoirs, tend to freeze up later in the year. It pretty much forces those birds to use the remaining open water habitat in the river channel, and especially those warm water sloughs. So that's been a habitat of emphasis for restoration for us. These habitats have different food value for ducks, and we'll talk about that again later, and also water availability. Large reservoirs are almost always available, but we don't think they provide very good food resources. They're primarily roosting areas for these birds. Again, same with the streams and rivers. Some of these impoundments, and we're talking managed impoundments here, usually have fairly good food production, and that'll be the main topic of discussion for today. And augmentation ponds, for example, another type of managed wetlands, they get water late, they're dry often in the summer and the fall, and so that hinders food production in those type of wetlands, we think. We don't have a lot of great information on that, but that's what we think is the story. And so you might wonder, well, how many acres of these various habitat types do we have? And it's only recently that we've been able to even get close to estimating that. Through the work that I mentioned earlier, through the Natural Heritage Program and that has been funded by the EPA, we've just now recently been able to get all the National Wetlands Inventory data digitized so we can make some of these calculations. So we'll talk more about this study at a future meeting, but we are mapping and assessing wetlands in the basin. So here's what we call a profile, a preliminary look at the information. This again is from the National Wetlands Inventory data. Those data are old, averaging probably about, what, 1980, Joanna? Late 70s even. So In my opinion, I think these might be overestimates of what's on the ground out here in the watershed today. But it looks like we have a lot of wetlands from this data, 250,000 acres. And again, this is the whole big watershed, right? All the way to the state lines, all the way down to the Monument Divide, right? Not just this river corridor. But if you think about the previous slide and the food values for these habitat types, maybe the story isn't so rosy for feeding our birds in our wetlands. These wet meadow habitats, including irrigated hay pastures, are generally dry, by the time it gets to the migration season for ducks. Reservoirs and shores, that's again quite a bit of acreage, but not a lot of good food resources in those habitats. Further down, we're looking at same thing with river and stream channels. Plies, we think, are better habitat, but they're variable. They're often dry. They're impacted heavily by grazing a lot of times. You look way down the list into emergent marshes that we think are really good habitats. There's only estimated 7,400 acres in this whole basin. That's not really a lot. But by having this information, it's been really valuable. We've been able to do some spatial modeling of this landscape, trying to estimate. We're doing this to try to set priority areas for investing our conservation dollars, if you will. So this was a first cut at a spatial model where we took each wetland, this is a GIS exercise, we took each wetland polygon from the GIS data, gave it a score based on the type of wetland it was, where we know like emergent marshes tend to have higher habitat quality, so they got a higher score. We looked at the proximity of other wetlands to each individual wetland in the basin too. So primarily those two factors were used here to create this model. So this is where we think the best habitat is in this basin and where the ducks should be during migration. I don't know what you think about that. Again, that was the first cut, but I thought it was pretty good based on my experience in this watershed. And of course, right here in the river basin, we're right in the thick of things, right in the red zone, which is right where we want to be doing work. More on that at a future meeting. Okay, so what's the problem for wildlife in this basin? I mentioned earlier about habitat changes. You've probably all heard that this river system used to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Well, of course, it's not like that anymore. Here are some photos from October 38 and then August 98. With all the diversions, we now have a system where we have a narrow constricted channel, woody vegetation encroachment on the banks and on the sandbars, and the oxbows and the sloughs and everything moving toward a later successional stage, which is generally not as productive for producing food for the birds. So a vastly different landscape compared to what we used to have. And so the impact on wildlife is fewer feeding and loafing areas for migratory waterfowl and some other wildlife, lower duck numbers, especially during the winter, and possibly even reduced hunter opportunity and success. So these have been issues, and we're trying to do something about this. We do have aggressive habitat restoration efforts ongoing in this basin. I think many of you in the room are well aware of this. We're doing sandbar clearing projects to try to set back vegetational succession and provide roosting and loafing areas in the river. We're doing warm water slough restoration to try to remove sediments and cattails so those sloughs flow so they stay open in the winter to provide wintering habitat. But neither of those type of projects provide a whole lot of new food resources for the birds, which are important. However, we're also focusing a lot on shallow water restoration and creation type projects. We call these moist soil units, and some are augmentation ponds or recharge ponds, which have a slightly different purpose. But when these are done right, they can be very productive habitats, and we'll talk about those in much more detail later in this workshop. So back to the Playa Lakes Joint Venture habitat modeling exercise, they actually put numbers to the value of these different habitat types. And some of this information came from the literature and some of it just based on expert opinion. It's called the energetic carrying capacity, which is how many duck use days can an acre of these various habitat types support. And again, we didn't think that river channels had a lot of food value for the birds, and it's confirmed by this analysis here, 50 duck use days per acre. We look at stock ponds, which again have their own purpose. They're not really meant for wildlife habitat directly, but do provide some benefits, substantially better, they think, 225 use days per acre. Getting better as we look to playas and warm water sloughs, again doubling to over 400. And then look at the huge jump when we're talking the prime habitats like emergent marshes and moist soil units that are managed intensively for wildlife purposes. Over 1,300 duck use days per acre estimated can be supported on those types of habitat. So the important thing is that these habitats on the landscape have dramatically different values, if you will, and I'm talking about the food resource values for these birds. And just some brief information. I don't want to steal thunder from the next speakers with this kind of information. But here are some managed wetlands on some of our state wildlife areas in the basin. And look at just the column on seeds, pounds of seeds per acre. There's a huge variation there from the teens up to over 800 pounds per acre. And again, every year is different. Colin said that wetland management can be sometimes more of an art than a science. But when things go well, hundreds of pounds of seeds can be produced per acre. And that's, when you have that kind of food in the wetland, the birds will respond, the birds will find it. And it should be no coincidence that Jackson and Red Lion are widely known as some of the best public waterfowl hunting sites in the whole basin. That's because these wetlands are managed intensively. They're managed very well, thanks to some of our experts here in the room, and it works. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the next speakers, but I hope that I've left you with a few of these take-home messages. And first of all, the South Platte corridor is a very important corridor in Colorado and in the flyway for waterfowl, and we're important primarily during that non-breeding season, migration in winter. So don't worry about if you got a brood of ducks on your pond. Yeah, there's a few birds during the nesting season, but we're not a major nesting area at all. And we wouldn't want wetland management compromised that could provide benefits for fall and winter. We wouldn't want that compromised to provide habitat for one brood of ducks. It's simply not worth it. The habitat quality and quantity has declined due to hydrological changes in this watershed. And the wetland restoration and management that we do here helps to some extent mitigate for a lot of habitat that's been lost because of these changes in the landscape. Well-managed landscapes can provide absolutely the best quality habitat that's out here on the landscape in terms of food resources for the birds. And then finally, wetland management here in this watershed contributes not only to what's going on in our easements, our state properties, our public hunting areas, and in our backyard, but it all feeds up to important national and international conservation plans for these birds that depend on these wetlands. So with that, I'll turn it over to Colin and the other speakers, or if there's any time, take a question. Thank you.